Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Paradigm Shift podcast. It's really good to be back, Eric.
It's been a while, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been a long time. School getting in the way.
Yeah, you can tell we have a very strict schedule.
Yeah, I mean, 6 episodes. That's not bad for, 6 months?
6 episodes, 6 months. We're basically, monthly.
Yeah, and we claim to be weekly.
We claim to be weekly. I don't see a problem here.
Yeah, absolutely no problem. The last 5 episodes, we've talked about the history of philosophy, right? Like, we went to from ancient China, talked a lot about ancient Greece.
Yep.
What do you remember?
Well, we talked about a lot of old history men, a lot of old people who said some profound things and tried to sound smart.
Socrates, Plato,
Socrates, Aristotle, Confucius.
Everybody likes Diogenes.
Everyone likes Diogenes.
He's by far the most entertaining character in ancient history.
Yeah, he's definitely the best for. He's definitely the best for a layman.
Okay, well, yeah, that's true. I don't know if you noticed, but there are a lot of YouTube channels that make videos. Oh, I forgot the name though. But just like fun stories, fun facts, and one of them was. Well, a lot of them are on Diogenes because he's so interesting to the layman. Just the funniest philosopher.
Salmonella Academy, for one. I've seen him, I recommend it.
Yep. But these next 5 episodes, I thought we'd deviate a little bit from the script and do like a series of episodes on fundamental principles or fundamental concepts in political philosophy.
Exactly, especially because, this whole history thing's getting a bit repetitive.
Well, we would have gone on to Rome next, but it's nice to switch things up, keeps us motivated. Hopefully, we'll catch the interest of some viewers.
For once.
This is for once. So, what do you think would be the most fundamental question in politics?
How much tan is too much?
Tan?
Yeah.
A very political question.
It is in America.
Well, arguably, I think it is. The original question, the first question should of course be whether we should even have a government, whether we should even have a state, right?
That seems
Politics deals in, of course, states, what sort of how you distribute property and power and what's not. So the original question is whether a state should even exist, whether anarchy would be better, right?
Right.
So that's what a lot of old thinkers have been up to, and by old thinkers I mean we're skipping about a millennia here, a millennium. So, because earlier we were talking about ancient Greece.
Right. Yeah.
We're hoping to 1700s, 1600s. Okay. So this is a bit more recent. I mean, like a thorough study of political philosophy. Of course, you have your Plato, it's the Republic. You have your Cicero. You have your old thinkers, right? But this is sort of the most influential works in modern day political philosophy, right?
Right.
Like sort of where we are right now. So maybe a bit more interesting, maybe not, but it's definitely different. So in deciding whether anarchy would be better than law, I was going to say law and order, but that's already biased. So let's just say, whether
I mean,
whether the state is better than the lack of one.
I mean, we're really talking like true anarchy here.
We're talking no government.
Pure anarchy. Pure anarchy. Everyone for themselves.
Yep. Some people, nowadays, there are definitely still anarchist thinkers. I've seen my YouTube comment sections. There are people who actually think this way.
There are people who actually unironically advocate anarchism?
I believe so. At least 200 years ago. But I mean, you can never know if it's unironic or not.
That's
could be just really bad sarcasm.
That's which one is that? Poe's law? Something like that.
I'm not sure.
One of the laws that like good enough to at one point satire will be undistinguishable from reality.
Oh, I haven't heard of it, but it sounds fair enough, considering the direction in which modern humor is going.
Yeah, it's like it's like you reach a certain point where someone can say something absolutely silly and you won't know if they're, actually serious or not.
We're almost. I mean, we're
We've
pretty much
got
at that point already.
we've got outspoken flat earthers. I'm sure like 90% of them are, just doing it for the joke, but there's actual outspoken flat earthers out there.
Mhm. Yeah, I have a strong suspicion. I don't know about 90%. Maybe. Probably the more outspoken ones do actually believe in it, though. I don't know. Or maybe not. Or maybe it's the opposite. The more outspoken you are, the more likely it is that you're just doing it for the joke, because you get more attention. But let's put aside our agenda and our political biases,
Yep.
and let's examine anarchy in an honest manner. Okay.
Let's take an objective view of anarchism.
Yeah. In other words, we're going to call it the state of nature. Okay. So that's what the title of the video is. The state of nature. It refers to life without government, without civil society.
It's funny how much more appealing it sounds when you just put a nicer name onto it,
Yeah, nature.
Exactly.
Natural.
It's not anarchism.
Artificial.
Exactly, it's not anarchism, it's not chaos, it's the state of nature, it's the circle of life.
I mean, anarchy has these negative connotations that people are constantly, like wrecking cars and invading shops on the streets and stuff,
Exactly, when I imagine anarchism, I imagine fire.
Yeah. It's because it sort of suggests like a revolution from where we are right now to an immediate state of no government, so that everybody just sort of goes out and protests and destroys things and whatever.
Yeah, it's funny, the power of names.
Yeah, that's true, and it's a central part of debate, honestly, is just framing things in the most positive manner possible, alternatively the most negative manner possible if you're talking about what your adversary has just...
Exactly. One person says controlled capitalism, other person says socialism.
Sure, yeah. That's a good example. But there's also a bit more of a distinction between state of nature and anarchy, in the sense that it's largely a hypothetical concept. It depends on the thinker you ask, right? But to some philosophers it really is a hypothetical situation in which we're living like prehistory, without any state, without any these official hierarchies. And to some of them it is like a real thing that has happened and that could happen. Well, I mean, to everybody it's a thing that could happen, but that is likely to happen. Of course, some thinkers like Aristotle would say that a state of nature is completely impossible, because a human is fundamentally, naturally, a political creature, and that without the state we're not humans anymore.
Right. I mean, the first thing that springs to mind for me is, like, in this hypothetical scenario, like, any technology advancements would immediately grind to a halt.
Yeah. You're probably quite on the same page as these thinkers we're going to be discussing in that case. Because that's definitely something that, for example, Thomas Hobbes states rather blatantly, that there will be no arts or science.
Yeah, exactly. There's no social progress because there's no society.
And also, probably you're too distracted with some other serious issues to go ahead and, like, make some paintings. Or
yeah, like food.
Exactly. But now we're going to see what some people would say in response to that, what the compelling other side is. But let's start sort of from the beginning. So, and by from the beginning, I don't mean ancient Greece. I mean Thomas Hobbes, whom I just mentioned. 1651, he wrote a work named Leviathan. This is probably the first really influential modern text on the state of nature, on sort of theories regarding the justification of the state. Okay, I don't know if you've heard of social contract theories. We'll talk about that more next time, assuming we have enough time to cover everything I want to cover in this episode. We'll be able to move on to that in the next episode.
Right.
So social contract theories, utilitarianism, justifying the state. Thomas Hobbes very influential in that, and part of justifying the state is thinking about what it would be like without the state, so the state of nature. And he had pretty much the first major theory on this. What do you know about Thomas Hobbes? Have you heard of this name before?
I have heard of the name, and I have heard of the book, I don't know too much about him. I mean, the name is familiar, obviously.
Yeah, in this series, I'm not gonna go along those same lines as in those previous episodes. I'm not gonna start saying, okay, well, here's his life story, okay? I'm just gonna say, here's his ideas. Here's what he wrote in Leviathan. So, okay, well, fine, a tiny bit of background, because it's sort of necessary. It's sort of necessary, not so much background, just a tiny bit.
Just a little.
Thomas Hobbes is really afraid of civil war in England, and that's why
reasonable.
That was his motivation. Yeah, that was his
reasonable
motivation.
At the time, yeah.
Exactly. That was his motivation for writing Leviathan, was because he was afraid of civil war and the anarchy that would come with it. So he wrote this defense of absolute monarchism, or absolute monarchy. Yeah. So that's sort of his deal. Like, we need a strong sovereign to maintain order, because he was afraid of the civil war, things changing, and us and then being plunged into anarchy. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the time, a man like him would obviously, in his position, defend monarchy over anything else, because it's the only real option he would have to defend at the time.
Yeah, but it's possible. Again, that environmental factors, just the nature of England at the time, led to his defense of monarchy. But his ideas definitely do seem to be focused on that we need like this one strong ruler. And he's not saying that he's not going along this divine rights of kings route, like people have this man has a natural right to be the ruler. But it's more like, we have to pick somebody. It's more like, the enlightened despot sort of line, but not quite the same. It's just the person who has power needs to be a sovereign, because somebody with power needs to be able to keep us all in order.
Right.
But that was a good point. Might be the case. So let's talk about Thomas Hobbes. So how does he describe the state of nature, the absence of government? He says that in this state, human nature will inevitably bring us into conflict. So he sort of begins by talking about human nature. This is largely what determines your view of the state of nature, is what is human nature. Because that's going to determine whether things are good or bad. Right? If people are naturally super altruistic, then without the state, we're still going to be helping each other just fine, so it's going to probably be really nice. But if people are really self-interested, then and violent, ambitious, greedy, then, probably the state of nature is going to be bad, because we can't keep those people in order, right?
And there's where the fun part comes in, because that's, sounds like it would be a case by case basis.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, I feel like it's hard to combine human behavior into a one general idea of human nature. I feel like based on the way you're raised, there are people generally more just altruistic than others.
Yeah.
And people more prone to violence and all that. And it's about how your parents raise you, but it's also about how your peers raise you. And that's actually an interesting concept, because you don't really have as many peers when there's a lack of state of nature.
Yeah,
when there's a lack of state,
Yeah. So it's sort of a question of, tabula rasa, blank slates. What would it happen if you were born into a completely natural state with sort of very few external influences?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, psychology has a lot to do with this. I think nowadays we would have a lot more profound understanding. A viewer tipped me off about David Hume. who
Oh.
wrote in the 1700s, who said that rational conjecture about human nature is impossible. He was an empiricist. So he wanted like actual experiments to determine what human nature is like.
Right.
Psychology, right? But but without delving too much into that, and it is very interesting. We're going to see what Thomas Hobbes thinks, because they do to some extent take into account, these thinkers do to some extent take into account, right, that some people are going to be good-willed and some people are going to be probably more violent. I mean, it depends on the situation as well, like the context, and opportunity makes a thief and what have you. But
Yeah.
but let's see what this is. So Thomas Hobbes says that human nature will inevitably bring us into conflict. So how do we determine what human nature is then? And Thomas Hobbes gives two options: introspection, honest introspection, right? It's hard to sort of get into the head of somebody else, but you can examine yourself and
Right.
how you think and stuff. And he says, and in addition to that, knowledge of physics. So it's not quite like empiricism, but it's somewhere close, because this is actually really interesting. Thomas Hobbes has a very interesting idea of how humans work in terms of physics, because he has heard the ideas of Galileo, right? That the ideas of the ideas of like forces and how they influence motion.
Pretty recent at the
Something-
time.
Yep, and that's that something in motion will remain in motion and whatever. And Thomas Hobbes, he agrees with this. He says that this is the case. It's simply a fact that something in motion will always remain in motion, and this applies to humans. And so he goes on a curious tirade about the human being in constant internal motion towards objects of desire.
Well, that's a curious idea.
And I have no idea what it means, internal motion, but surely something strange.
I guess it means the way people strive towards their goals.
That's probably the most rational way to sort of understand it. So he calls this felicity, the drive to achieve objects of desire. So putting aside the whole like everybody is in constant motion, constantly trying to like literally constant motion, everything is meant rather literally, and just focusing on the sort of figurative idea probably makes a lot of sense, right? Because to our intuition it seems reasonable that people constantly try to achieve their objects of desire.
Right.
If we try to satisfy our desires, that sort of everything we do it usually because we wanted to do it, right?
Right.
Even in a situation in which we are coerced, right? You always have another option. So he calls that felicity. And then he says that, well, in a state of nature, everybody requires power to achieve objects of desire. People want power so they can achieve their objects of desire. People want power so they can achieve future objects of desire. And so he defines power as one's present means to obtain some future apparent good. I should mention that I'm using as the main source for this an Introduction to Political Philosophy by Jonathan Wolfe, recommended to me by my history teacher. So this is my main source, but I have used some of the interwebs, of course. So if I directly quote him at some time or other inadvertently, just assume that anything I say that's wrong is my idea, and anything I say that's right is his idea, so I don't inadvertently take credit here.
Right, absolutely.
Yep. So this one's just a quote from Leviathan. One's present means to obtain some future apparent good. So I wrote in the footnote, or in the margins of the book here, like, okay, well, can somebody not have power? Can somebody not intentionally try to perform an evil? And it's an interesting question, but maybe not the most relevant.
Right.
So we'll put that aside and just think of power as the means to obtain something that you desire, right?
Right.
So the problem here, of course, is that power is relative. If you have a lot of power, then the people around you necessarily have less power, right?
Yes.
So because everybody wants power, the fight for power becomes competitive in nature, right?
Right.
And I'm going to quote Leviathan again. A person cannot assure the power and means to live well, which he hath present, without the acquisition of more. So also, in order to achieve objects of desire, you need to be constantly trying to become more powerful. Like, staying at the same point of power, whilst others are trying to become more powerful, will result in your relative power being less. It sounds like it's a video game or some anime.
You have to increase your power level.
Yeah. So you always have to be trying to acquire more power.
Right.
So, power, competitive.
Power competitive.
And he says that there's even more competition.
Oh boy.
Because in order to achieve power, there are some choices, right? Riches, reputation. You want men under your command, right? But many of these things are competitive. Riches, people. There's a scarce amount of resources, so there's competition. Men under command, scarce amount of humans. It's competitive.
Uh-huh.
Reputation brings power, right? Well, if your reputation is really good, then again, the relative reputation of someone else is less. Reputation is competitive.
Oh boy.
And he stresses this idea that there's sort of a lot of scarcity, right? So people who desire the same kind of thing will often desire the same thing, and this results in competition, right? For that same item. So your question might be, how does this result in like a sort of war? Because Thomas Hobbes stresses that without a government, the state of nature is just a state of war. Everybody's fighting each other.
Right, every man for themselves.
Every man for themselves. The war of all against all, or everyone against everyone, or So how does the competition necessarily result in a war? Well, firstly, everybody is relatively equal, in the sense that the weakest has strength enough to kill the strongest, even if that requires secret machination or confederacy with others. I threw in a few Leviathan quotes there, but that's sort of the main idea, is that humans are still relatively equal in strength.
Right, yeah, physically.
Right. Physically. Like, yeah.
In capability.
In capability. And even if one man is a lot stronger than another, then you can assassinate him.
Yeah, you have weaponry, you have surprise.
Or you can cooperate with others. We see that all the time. Revolutions around the world.
Absolutely.
We rise up against the government with enough people, and you can probably overrun them. Well, sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. But regardless. And then he stresses that this equality creates fear and suspicion. Remember that. Fear and suspicion. Because nobody's invulnerable from attack from any other single person. And people... There's competition all the time for power and reputation, for objects of desire. So if you have property, somebody might want that property, and you have no guarantee that they won't be able to kill you and take it from you. Right?
Right.
You have no guarantee that they won't kill you even if you have no property, because they see you as a threat to their property.
Right.
You have no guarantees. Just constant fear and suspicion. So people will attack for gain, to achieve objects of desire. People will attack for safety, to preempt possible threats. And people will attack for reputation. Because if they defeat somebody who has a high reputation, then that grants them high reputation, and reputation provides protection. Because if you have the reputation of being powerful and strong, then people are going to be too afraid to attack you.
Right.
You can see that there's just constant fear and suspicion.
Right.
Everybody's afraid, and that causes a cycle of violence.
Yeah, I can absolutely agree with that.
Mm-hmm. So there are some objections might be brought up to these ideas, right? For example, perhaps do these ideas rely on a man being portrayed as unrealistically selfish or cruel?
I mean, I feel like necessarily it doesn't have to be all man that is selfish and cruel. I feel like if you have this type of environment, the people who are more willing to be aggressive will generally come on top.
You're absolutely right, of course. Well, of course, there's disagreements over everything, but I see you as being rather right here, and a lot of thinkers will reiterate this. It only requires a few rotten apples to ruin everything, because a few people willing to attack for gain will create the fear and suspicion in people because they know that there's somebody out there willing to attack you, and once you have the fear and suspicion, you might have to attack yourself for gain, safety, reputation, right?
Yeah.
So it's the fear that sort of leads to attacking for safety rather often. It's not necessarily motivated by cruelty, even if some individual people who are willing to be cruel maybe have a decreased sense of empathy. Seems completely reasonable, right?
Right.
Might ruin it for everyone by causing others to then have to attack, even if they're not cruel by nature, to try to achieve self-preservation.
Right, yeah, out of like absolute necessity.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, maybe somebody might object, well, everyone can't be so suspicious that there's constant fighting, right? We can't be constantly fighting with each other. But Thomas Hobbes does concede that, well, there'll be periods of peace. Absolutely. He defines the state of war as being a constant readiness to fight. Because you don't necessarily have to be fighting to suffer the consequences of the state of nature, because fear and suspicion. It's a terrible way to live.
Mm-hmm.
So that objection falls flat. So somebody might say, okay, well, why are people so suspicious? Why wouldn't they just sort of, use the motto, live and let live? Just like let others do what they want, and I'll do what I want. Why would people be so suspicious and fearful of each other? We talked about this to some extent already. There might be just a few rotten apples, just a few people willing to go to those lengths, and you hear of it, and you will be fearful and suspicious,
Right.
because you know it's happening, right?
Yeah.
But also Hobbes provides like a modern day example. He says, imagine how fearful you are, how much suspicion you show of people around you when you lock your doors at night, when you lock your chests and drawers from people in the same household. Now imagine how much greater that fear and suspicion would be without the protection of the law. Clearly, we are already suspicious and fearful. And even though the law gives us some respite in this matter, it's not like sufficient. And in a state of nature, we don't even have that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even now with the law, if even with active law enforcement around you, if somebody if you leave your doors unlocked and somebody comes in and stabs you, it doesn't matter if there's the law enforcement near you, because you're still gonna get stabbed and die. Sure, it's a deterrent because the other person is like, okay, if I stab that guy, I'm gonna go to jail.
Yeah.
But it doesn't stop the actual physical in the moment act that some people are willing to go through.
Yep, so we'll see some anarchist thinkers claim that the state is the cause of this evil, right? But we'll get to that in a little while. So that might be one counter-argument, but we'll get to that. So Hobbes just wanted to give this example, like, I'm a rational human being, and I'm fearful and suspicious of people around me, and I prove that all the time. Without the protection of the law, without that, I'm never gonna feel safe.
Right.
I'm gonna be constantly fearful and suspicious. So, one objection, probably the final and biggest objection, is what about morality? Okay. Because Hobbes says that without the law, there is no such thing as justice or injustice. There's no such thing as right and wrong. There is no place for morality, which sort of suggests that morality is somehow
intrinsic to law.
Yeah, that morality is relative. So anybody can, or arbitrary. Anybody can determine what morality is by just creating a code of law, which many people would disagree with. But perhaps more importantly, I mean that's a crazy idea. It's a scary idea, right? If morality is just completely arbitrary and there's no such thing as right or wrong, then that gives somebody else, if they decide to, or if they believe that they have the right to subordinate you, make you their slave, kill you, anything, then according to Hobbes, that's fine, right? They can do that because there's no law. It's a scary idea, but perhaps more importantly, the idea is that everybody has what Hobbes calls the right of nature, which is this right to self-preservation, right? Like, that's the main idea, is that even if morality applies, nobody can really criticize someone else for self-defense, for trying to protect themselves, and in the state of war that Hobbes describes, that's really what the problem is.
Yeah, people are more likely to take brutish actions and explain them off as self-preservation.
Exactly. And this is perhaps the key point, right? Like, without the government, without the law, there's no unified vision and no power to decide what's an offense and what's worthy of punishment and what kind of punishment. So everybody has to make that decision for themselves. And everybody has to determine for themselves what level of self-defense is necessary and when. Right? So for that reason, you can't really criticize them, because it's their responsibility, it's their own responsibility to, like, if they feel threatened, then that's enough of a moral reason often for them to feel that they can go ahead and attack somebody, even without being cruel.
Yeah, in a state of nature like that, I feel like most people would just, create their own definition of self-defense, and it would vary heavily from person to person.
Exactly. And that's probably one of the problems that we'll see with our next thinker, John Locke. Because he claims that there can be a unified moral code in a state of nature. So just the last thing I'd like to mention about Thomas Hobbes is that he does have this set of laws of nature that he figures out, that he says you can deduce with reason. You can rationally figure out a set of laws of nature, which sort of acts as a moral code. And that seems to undermine his own idea that there can be no morality in the state of nature. But what Jonathan Wolff points out is that this is meant to be a difference between collective rationality and individual rationality. You know the prisoner's dilemma, I'm sure.
Yep.
Yeah. So the idea is that if everybody together were to cooperate, everybody can see that rationally, we can cooperate and things will be better. But also, and this is sort of the sort of collective rationality is what the laws of nature describe, right? Like, everybody should seek peace. Everybody, sort of the biblical golden rule as well, like, do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Absolutely.
So
In a perfect, unified collective, is the best option for everyone would be, just like white peace, like nobody does anything to anyone. But therein comes the problem that not everyone is rational.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And also that sometimes going against collective rationality is what seems to be the rational option. Because if you assume that everybody else is trying to be collectively rational, then it's good for you to deviate from it, right? Like in the prisoner's dilemma.
Right, exactly. It gives you more.
If they're going to try to cooperate, then you have absolutely every motivation to try to not.
Exactly. If everyone is in the idea that everyone will work collectively, then you go back to what Hobbes said about the idea of felicity, like power gain, suddenly, acting a lot more aggressively is in your benefit because it grants you power.
Yeah, it grants you the power to achieve future desires, and that's the thing, right? So even though Hobbes devises this set of laws of nature that sort of suggests that it's possible for there to be a collective rationality and for life in the state of nature to be okay, he accepts that these won't apply because, he accepts that these will only apply when you have reasonable belief that others around you will also abide by them, but he recognizes that rarely will you have that reasonable belief, and therefore they really won't apply, because you have every reason to believe that people around you will deviate from it to try to gain an advantage, and then it just doesn't even matter. So, Thomas Hobbes very against very against the state of nature.
Reasonable.
But what does John Locke say? He wrote about 30 years after Thomas Hobbes. In 1689, he published the Second Treatise of Civil Government, in which he, to some extent, even defends the state of nature. He says it can't possibly be a state of war. This is a completely incorrect equivocation. Okay, so where did Hobbes go wrong, according to John Locke, is the question. Well, John Locke didn't necessarily target his Second Treatise of Civil Government against Hobbes. His official target was one Sir Robert Filmer, who was a defender of the doctrine of divine right of kings. The ideas of Sir Robert Filmer was that God appointed Adam the first sovereign, and contemporary sovereigns can all trace their lineage back to Adam, and that's like the divine right.
Right.
Yeah. So John Locke opposes that, although it seems that often he's responding to Hobbes. So some scholarly debate over that matter, but it doesn't matter to us. We'll weigh these arguments, okay? So John Locke says that in the state of nature there is a fundamental equality, but this equality, he means it in a different manner than Hobbes. He doesn't mean that he doesn't mean this idea that everybody can defeat anybody else, right? Like people are roughly equal in physical capabilities.
Yep.
He means that nobody has the right to subordinate any other. Nobody has the right to rule by nature. And the thing is, Hobbes would largely agree with that. He doesn't think that anybody has the natural right to rule. He thinks that power is what gives you the right to rule. So that's sort of okay. Then John Locke says that the laws of nature. He also has the laws of nature. So he sort of has these laws of nature that he believes can also be discovered by reason, and he constructs these. But John Locke says that we have a duty to obey the laws of nature.
Okay, but what if you don't?
Well, the question is, do we have a duty? And how does John Locke demonstrate that we have a duty? So, here maybe one of the problems that modern day readers of John Locke have is that he relies on God to some extent. So he says that God put us on Earth, and it would be nonsensical for him to put us on Earth to die. God God is the only person with the right to take somebody's life, and therefore we have to preserve mankind. Everybody has the God-mandated duty to preserve mankind, not just yourself, but others. But some modern-day followers of Locke have replaced this idea with just rationality, that you can deduce this rationally, with the same sort of collective rational idea that we had with Hobbes, right?
Right.
So, to Locke, it's really important that you have a moral duty to obey the law of nature, that morality will exist in the state of nature, and that everybody can recognize this, can deduce it rationally, can deduce the laws of nature, and will feel a duty to obey it because collective rationality is superior in this situation than just being in a state of war, which will inevitably happen if everybody goes against the rules. So you see like an immediate juxtaposition between Hobbes and Locke.
Right, but
so
then that just completely discounts, people who are completely willing to defy this morality.
And it also discounts many other things, like people agreeing on this morality in the first place, being able to deduce it, or people agreeing on people agreeing to, well, like you said, people agreeing to follow it. But let's hold on. I wanted to say more, but I'll get to it in a moment because I need to sort of set it up. So as we talked about earlier, Hobbes had this idea fear and suspicion will still exist. And that's what causes us to tumble into the wall. So what's Locke's response to this? Right, he doesn't really account for what we just talked about a few minutes ago, that a few rotten apples will ruin it for everyone. So, and because you can reasonably believe other people to deviate from the law of nature, it's just as rational for you to also deviate from it than, continuing along, continuing to abide by it and thus being exploited. So this suggests a strategy for sort of disproving Hobbes's pessimistic conclusion, which relies on human nature. If humans are naturally altruistic, as I referred to towards the beginning of this episode, then we have no problem, supposedly. But Locke doesn't take this route. Like I said, anarchist thinkers do, so we'll get to that. Locke doesn't take this route. Instead, he agrees that you need a law enforcer in order to maintain order. So we have the laws of nature, but now we need to enforce them. So how does he do that without a state? This is your chance to buzz in.
I mean, I guess there's just the general collective of, like, the mob of people.
That's pretty much it. He says that everybody has a natural right to mete out justice.
To apply the law.
Yeah, to apply the law of nature. Everybody has this natural right as a collective. So if they see the law of nature being gone against, then they will punish the offender even if they were not the victim of the crime. Okay. And to some extent, Locke justifies this with an example. He sees that aliens, people who immigrate to a country, can be punished by the sovereign even without consenting to the laws. So he doesn't understand how this can be the case unless the sovereign has a natural right to punish people who go against the law of nature. Right? Somebody walks across the border, kills somebody. Why do we have the right to punish him? Clearly, it's a natural right. He doesn't need to consent to the laws. So what's the problem here? What's the problem with everybody being a collective law enforcer?
Well, I mean, first off, there's, generally mobs aren't the most accurate at dispensing the law.
I think I understood it there at the end. So they will misjudge situations, pretty much. Mentality.
Yep, and over apply.
And over apply.
As I've taken this analogy of applying the law, no?
Yeah. They will give you a little too much medicine.
Yeah, exactly. If you have a mob and somebody like steals $5 from the counter, then how do you punish that in the well, you wouldn't have $5 because, state of nature, but if someone did something minor and you just trusted the entire collective of the people around that person to punish that, I mean, how are you gonna have it be proportional in any way?
Yeah. That's a great question, for example. And that's something that Locke, to some extent, recognizes. He sees that, okay, here's a problem. People are going to squabble over what the punishment should be. People are going to disagree over what actions are worthy of punishment. People are going to squabble over justice.
Exactly. People love to overreact.
So, and something that Hobbes would probably point out is that some people might be too afraid to exercise this natural right because they could be retaliated against by like-minded individuals to the perpetrator.
Exactly. Small things could easily go unpunished, and that just gives way to a culture of more small offenses being committed.
people just won't agree to the laws of nature. If some groups are going to have a different idea of the laws of nature, and then it doesn't even matter because there isn't going to be somebody to punish, and even when there is somebody to punish, then or somebody to enact the punishment, I mean, then they'll be afraid to do so because there's an enemy group who would happily reenact punishments on you in return. So it's a problem. How does Locke deal with it? He says that there's a natural abundance. He disagrees with this Hobbesian idea that there's going to be competition because of the scarcity of objects of desire. He says there's lots of land, and people prefer to get things themselves rather than attack each other. Because morality, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Hobbes would probably respond to that, well, products can still be scarce. Even though there's lots of land, then you will save yourself the trouble of having to farm it for a year.
Yeah, exactly.
Or whatever.
That's
if you just get the wheat from your neighbor.
Yeah, that's what I kind of wanted to bring up. It brings up this, like, for a person living in the state of nature, it would bring up this moral dilemma of, like, which one is more worth it, upholding your morality and just, like, over a long time collecting, you know, scarce amounts of food that you can scavenge up, or there's a guy right there who's been doing it for, like, years, and he's got a whole big store ready. He's got a whole storage.
You could feed, like, my entire group of 10 raiders.
Yeah, exactly. You could take my entire, like, alliance, my little tribe I've made. We'd be feasting for days, months.
And if we don't, we'll starve because there's too many mouths to feed at the moment.
Yeah,
Obvious what the response is.
Yeah, it might even be out of necessity. Exactly.
Yeah, and the necessity even extends to, like, well, theoretically we could just settle down and farm, but then another set of raiders will actually attack us.
Yeah, necessity always comes over morality, I feel, for people.
Yeah, possibly because it is an intrinsic part of morality, is the sense of self-preservation.
Right, at the end of the day, no matter how altruistic you get, people aren't gonna die for altruism.
Well, the concept of altruism is that you will die for altruism.
Yeah, but I'm saying it will rarely ever go to such an extent.
So what you're saying is that people aren't altruistic?
Well, I feel like...
If people were altruistic, then people would die.
I mean, I feel like the problem is treating altruism like an on-off switch.
How so?
Where I feel like it'd be more apt to describe as someone as to a certain level of altruistic. Can you hear that in the background?
I can.
Yes, it's very loud.
What is it?
It's a vacuum.
It's a vacuum.
It's a vacuum.
Yeah, that's fine.
Very good timing.
Yeah, well, I don't know of people who treat altruism like an on-off switch. I think people treat altruism as an ideology like any other. If somebody is an altruist, then this is how they'll behave. There's no turning it off.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, I don't mean that as in you can turn it on or off. I mean more as in, like, you're either altruistic or you're not.
Well, we have many sort of theories of morality in between. Some people might be utilitarianistic.
Mm-hmm.
But okay. We'll get more to the altruism in a moment. So that's one problem, is scarcity survives in the terms of products. And Locke even again defeats his own idea by admitting another problem. This is a common theme here. Well, at least he's admitting his own problems.
Nah.
He says that, well, money and trade, once they develop, will lead to greed, and now they'll become pressure on land and production, right? Because people, if you produce, overproduction doesn't just go to waste, right?
Right.
You can trade it and get money.
Exactly.
So now everybody wants as much stuff as possible, and that creates the economic pressure that leads to scarcity, which will lead to Hobbesian war.
Exactly. Even if you remove the, like, government mandated federal, like, currencies, people will always have a sense of trade.
Yeah. So even though Locke says that at first things will be okay, he admits that, well, it's gonna get bad. So even Locke believes in a necessity of the state. This is a common theme. So it has been about an hour. I'm wondering if we want to get into talking about Rousseau and talking about anarchism, or whether we want to leave this for next time.
Well, we've
It might
actually.
still take a reasonable period of
Well, I
time.
mean, we've only been online for like. We've only been talking for like 50 minutes.
50 minutes? Okay, well, if the viewers won't feel that this is too long to pay attention to the entire thing, then we may as well continue. What viewers do we have after all? So you're interested, I take it. You want to hear what Rousseau thinks?
I am interested, yes. I would like
Very
to
well.
keep this flow going.
Very well, then I will grant you your request. So Locke and Hobbes have more or less agreed that the state becomes necessary. Locke suggests sort of this possible restraint, but it's only temporary in nature, and they'll end up in war regardless, and probably very open to debate whether that restraint even exists. So even if we were to accept everything Locke says, still a problem. So what comes next? Rousseau gets even more optimistic.
Oh boy.
Have you heard of Rousseau?
That's the guy who does the piano videos on YouTube.
That's true, yes, I noticed that as well about his name. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a Frenchman. I'm guessing, based on the name. I think, yeah, pretty sure.
Probably.
Who wrote in the 1700s. He wrote a text named Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. I think the actual name is a lot longer, but that's what it's shortened to. So, based on that name, what do you think? A discourse on the origin of inequality. What might his opinion be of the state?
State bad.
Yes. And I'm gonna explain now how that works. So, Rousseau says that John Locke and Thomas Hobbes have incorrectly applied modern man to savage man. Right? He says that these people have used how we act now, applied that sort of nature to what people might have acted like in prehistory, and then seen some terrible things happen. And he goes, yep, I agree that if right now we were to abolish the state and return to nature, then society has corrupted us, and we will act in these terrible ways. But back then we were not corrupted. Back then we were quite different. Okay.
Alright.
So this is how he describes it. Firstly, he starts from a slightly different premise, which I alluded to earlier, that compassion and pity, natural aspects of human nature, will restrain violence. And this needs to be distinguished from Locke's idea, which is the law of nature, it's this respect for other people's rights.
Right. The idea of morality.
Rousseau agrees with Hobbes that morality has no place in the state of nature. He just recognizes this aspect of nature of compassion and pity, that they will restrain our desire to, or the necessity, often, to enact violence. Is that we have compassion and pity, and we always try to avoid this if possible. So, Hobbes would naturally point out that these two drives are opposite each other. The desire to achieve felicity, the desire to achieve happiness, to achieve objects of desire, and the desire to avoid violence, for compassion and pity. Then necessarily these will come into conflict, as we've sort of talked about. Like, sometimes you'll feel a necessity to attack someone in order for self-preservation. So what would happen then? In fact, you probably would still perform the attack. You'd probably still try to preserve yourself, but now you'd just suffer doubly, because not only are you in conflict, but you're hating yourself for having to be in conflict, because you feel compassion and pity for the person you're attacking. You see this, like, appeal?
Right, I understand what you mean.
Yeah, It's like not only are we attacking each other, but because we are naturally compassionate, we feel bad about it.
But I mean, I feel like
So,
wouldn't the modern man have even more like moral dilemmas with such a thing?
uh,
I mean, most people generally aren't suited for, assault and battery and murder.
yeah, I don't know. Rousseau doesn't really deal with that.
I
I'm just
don't.
going to focus on his description of the states of nature for now, because it doesn't really rely on the
Alright,
assumption I lined out earlier.
alright, I just don't really see the difference between prehistoric and modern man here.
You'll see a difference, because Rousseau will describe it for us, or I will describe it for you, and Rousseau has described it for me through Jonathan Wolfe.
Alright?
Uh, so, so how does Rousseau deal with this idea of the drives coming into conflict and causing extra suffering? He goes back to Locke's idea of abundance. Okay? Not natural abundance of land, though, but, well, sort of natural abundance of land. What he means is sort of a natural abundance of space. Prehistoric man, according to Rousseau, lived a solitary life, with few desires, and would thus rarely come into conflict with other people, because they'd rarely even see other people, and they'd rarely have the desire that they would need to take from somebody else. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Kind of.
So, according to Rousseau, the savage man, the prehistoric man, only desires food, drink, sleep, sexual satisfaction. Very simple things. Few desires. And because you rarely come into contact with others, because it's a low population, the Earth is a big place, you rarely have to come into competition with somebody else to have to fight them, to even want to fight them, because you have compassion and pity now as a restraining force, so that you don't actually have an object of desire that you want to take from this person. You don't want power, because you're not gonna, what are you gonna do with that power? And you don't really care about what other people think. You rarely come across them. You don't even have language yet, so you couldn't even communicate with them. You understand?
Right, okay, I think I get what you mean.
So, to some extent, Rousseau has an appealing outlook because it seems more historically accurate, at least to begin with. Like, somewhere a very, very long time ago, before we had societies.
Right, before we had, like, tribes.
Before we had tribes. Well, David Hume would object to that. He says that humans are naturally social beings.
Well, yeah.
But, so that, and many would agree.
That's kind of what I wanted to get into, yeah. Like, I feel like tribes would... I feel like generally tribes would naturally form and society would naturally form from that the way it has.
Yeah. So we'll get to that. You will see Rousseau concede this in the end eventually as well. So we're seeing, like I said, we see a common theme with these thinkers. But he sort of just goes further back than Hobbes and Locke. He and says that, you know, before we had language, before we had luxuries, we had few objects of desire. We had no reason to be fighting with each other. We had no competitive desires. We rarely even interacted with each other, which may have been true in some cases. But I mean, if we go back to the evolutionary beginnings, then I'm under the impression that even apes lived together, and when they left the forests, so to speak, into the plains, we still lived together. I'm under the impression fossil records show that we lived together. But let's just run with Rousseau's thought processes here, okay? So let's accept this. People lived a simple, solitary life with few desires, and so rarely came into conflict. There's no need to attack for gain because you have all the objects of desire you need at your fingertips. There's no need to attack for safety because you're not under threat. There's no need to attack for reputation because you have no need for reputation or want for reputation or ability to communicate with other people. So even accepting this, it seems rather unwelcoming, right?
Right.
Because Rousseau is like, the state has corrupted us. It would have been way better in the state of nature. But like, this still seems rather unwelcoming because you don't have others, so we're losing the social aspect of
Right.
of being a human. You don't have all the luxuries we have nowadays.
Yeah, and this is making me think a little like, generally when you think about it, humans, a single lone human is pretty weak, Like when you compare it to the ecosystem around them, like the reason, like if you have a single human against like, wild animals, generally like the reason as society we like manage to take down mammoths and stuff is because we work together and we like
Exactly.
coordinated. I feel like as a sole human, yeah, you would be pretty screwed because you scavenge herbs and small animals until you come across an animal too big for you and you die.
Quite possibly. And that is, again, it just seems contrary to what we've observed in terms of historical studies.
Right, yeah. I feel like the proof is there that, tribes would form and societies would form from that because it's not like a thing that happened once. It happened everywhere across the globe separately.
But here, like, Rousseau doesn't contest that tribes form. He's just talking about before tribes forming. Now, so what we would think, or maybe the key here is, were there ever solitary humans running around? Maybe like a few people will leave their tribe, be ostracized and have to leave, but I feel like from an evolutionary perspective, as animals, we've always lived in packs. So,
right. So I mean, what I'm like getting from this is that the state of nature would be quote unquote better than what we have right now, but it would be impossible to keep.
Exactly. So let me finish the story.
Right, sorry.
Sort of outline. Yeah, it's fine because you're gonna hear pretty much what you're talking about. So this seems unwelcoming, and it seems to lack a dynamic for change. Well, it doesn't because we've outlined it. But from what I talked about Rousseau's perspective, he has not yet explained his dynamic for change, right? So, what does Rousseau say? He says that there'll be population growth, and that will lead to scarcity. People will people will need to start cooperating to hunt. People will need to start cooperating to farm. People will develop language. They'll begin living together. They'll begin to innovate, and this is the source of all the bad things in the world. Okay. So, but it sounds bad, right? But let me now talk you through it because it has some application to real life. So, Rousseau says that once we develop farming societies, once we have agriculture, once we begin to overproduce, and we have time to spend it on, we have time to spend on other things, on metallurgy, on development, on science, we start getting luxuries. We start getting products that are a luxury, and then we become dependent on them. Even though at first they bring extra happiness and extra comfort, we quickly become accustomed to them. They become a part of our natural state.
Right, I get what you mean. You start working on things that are not necessary. You're lagging.
Oh, am I lagging?
Oh, now you're good.
Okay, so where did we cut off?
You said something about status quo.
Yeah. So the luxuries, once we develop some luxuries, they will make us happy temporarily, but we become accustomed to them, and now we require them just to remain at a sort of neutral position.
Right.
And we just want more luxuries, and then they start building up.
Yeah, yeah.
Much, Rousseau's central idea is that modern man is no happier than savage man.
Right, I see.
We have become accustomed to all these. People still kill themselves. Did savage man kill himself? There's depression and sadness and suffering. And look at all the luxuries we have.
Exactly. I mean, like humans start creating things that are not necessary, until they become necessary.
And then it just spirals out of control. So this is why Rousseau feels that the state of nature was nicer, because we had simple desires and we could achieve those simple desires. Can you quickly come up with a school of thought from ancient Greece that we've discussed that sort of fits this ideal? I'll help you out here.
What?
Epicureanism. I don't know if you remember.
I
Discussed Epicureanism.
somewhat remember.
The idea that, a good life is one in which, it's sort of a utilitarianistic perspective in which happiness is good and suffering is bad, but it stresses simple pleasures. So, like, living a happy life on a diet of bread and water or whatever. So this, I think, is a rather compelling outline, because it lines up extremely well with how we sort of intuitively see ourselves in the modern day.
Right.
So that is I think probably the most interesting part of Rousseau's explanation here. So he says that we stop developing negative emotions once we start having property, like pride, envy, shame, and contempt. We start wanting things that other people have because we have more profound desires. And we have language, so now we can insult each other. We have pride because the more stuff you have, the more important you are, the better you are. And if somebody maybe attacks you or punches you, then this is no longer damage, it's a personal affront. It's a personal affront, and you're insulted,
Right, so basically the idea is that the state of nature is like a perfect but impossible state.
Exactly. That's sort of what we get here. So unfortunately, eventually, the state becomes necessary, because we start living in societies, we start living together, and scarcity becomes a thing, which means that all the Hobbesian drives begin to apply, and a state is necessary to keep us in order. So a state of war doesn't occur, right? So we can maintain peace, and importantly, according to Rousseau, protect the rich, because it's the rich that end up making the laws to protect their property. It applies to everyone equally. The first laws, right? I mean, laws apply to everyone equally, but they favor the rich, he says, and this is the origin of inequality.
Right, so this is actually starting to sound like a defensive government.
It does start to sound a little bit like a defensive government, but that's sort of Rousseau's point. Like, he concedes that the state becomes necessary, but he doesn't concede that life under the state is better than it was before the state. He finds it as a shame that we developed, right? Now, unfortunately, we also can't necessarily see that things were ever as good as he describes them, because the amount of solitude that he depends on doesn't seem to be apparent in historical records.
Right.
But I think there's a rather illuminating viewpoint on just that we can sort of maybe learn something from as well. Right? Like, just the desire for more stuff and material possessions,
just
luxuries.
Find a nearby cave and become a hermit.
Or not. So what I'm hearing is, if I just leave society and run out into the wild, everything will be really good.
Yeah.
Well, no, because Rousseau says that you've already been corrupted, right? You've already become accustomed to all these luxuries.
Right. You're not the savage man. You're a modern man.
Yeah. Perhaps I have not read. I haven't read the discourse on the origin of inequality, so I don't know if he refers to them as savage man, but that seems like one of the negative connotations that you'd avoid in a debate. If this is the argument you're making.
Right.
Back when man was
savage. Back when man was easygoing.
Content and easygoing.
Back when man was cool with it.
Mm-hmm.
And also now in like the 21st century it would be even harder because like everything is owned by governments in the entire Earth. There's various spots on the map that you could find that is like completely lawless. Obviously,
Well,
there's
yeah.
some places where there are like tribes preserved,
Yeah. Yeah.
but even that is
So,
just like pseudo
yeah.
lawless.
So what we learned from Rousseau is that uh, life right now is we okay. We are ungrateful. Is what we learned. And what we also learn from Rousseau is that even with compassion and pity and all these aspects that we like to associate with human nature, the state becomes necessary. It becomes intolerable without one.
All right.
So, what then do the anarchist thinkers have going for them? What then do they believe that was missed out on by these three thinkers, including a little bit of David Hume? I haven't looked into him as much as I would have hoped to. What have they all missed out on?
What is the anarchist defense?
What is the anarchist defense? See, I'm sure you're curious about this. I was curious about this. Anarchism is such a big thing.
Yeah.
And I've seen those YouTube comment sections in which anarchists defend themselves. So, firstly, Jonathan Wolff recognizes three different arguments for anarchism, okay? And this is very rudimentary. We'll get back to anarchism for sure in future episodes. But just on the state of nature, right? That's the topic.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one was developed by one Peter Kropotkin in the 1880s as a competing theory for evolution, which was cooperation. So he finds, and many other anarchist thinkers have, lots of evidence of uncoerced cooperation between humans and in the animal kingdom. And he finds that this idea of survival of the fittest could apply easily to cooperation, because it's better, supposedly. You survive easier if two people cooperate than if two people are at each other's throats, one of them will die, right?
Right.
So, seems feasible. But there's lots of evidence of exploitation too, and as we've seen from Hobbes, as we've seen from Locke, as we've seen from Rousseau, the exploitation will often seem rational in the end, and a few individuals can easily ruin it for all, even if there is this idea that eventually, in the state of nature, over enough time, humans will evolve to be super cooperative. Well, we can't be sure about that, and there's evidence for exploitation, and it often seems rational, and will also provide some fitness in the evolutionary sense, right?
Right.
Like in some cases, in order to survive, you have to exploit another person, obviously. So the evolution can't entirely be based on cooperation. And easily, some people might still have to exploit each other, and this will be beneficial, and they will evolve with the trait, if it can be called a trait. Okay, now we're talking very vague ideas. So what does the anarchist then say? The second argument is that there are no individuals that will ruin it for everyone. There are no rotten apples that will that will be uncooperative, that will be violent and evil, and the state is the source of all the evil.
Okay, I mean that just sounds like propaganda.
It sounds like propaganda because you're gonna ask, how on earth are you gonna demonstrate this is true? Like, where is the argument? Where is the logic that leads you to the conclusion that everybody would have been happy-go-lucky in the state of nature, and that somehow the state is what indoctrinates us into being evil? I don't know. I haven't read the literature. Maybe I should read some anarchist literature, because surely they have some mechanism by which this happens.
Right, maybe we should look into this next episode.
But I'm gonna have to stop you there and say we don't look into this, because Jonathan Wolff in pretty much a single sentence debunks this, as you would expect.
Uh-huh.
So we can't prove, right, that in the state of nature, before governments, people were exploiting each other. Okay, we can't prove that everybody weren't super nice. and that these fledgling states are what created the evil. Okay?
Mm.
But we can, with a simple argumentative technique, demonstrate that this anarchist idea makes no sense. So they say that the state is what causes all evil. Before that, nobody was evil. Nobody would have been able to ruin it for everyone. There would have been no fear or suspicion because everybody's perfectly altruistic, and therefore there'd be no Hobbesian war, no bad things until the state was created. So this argument is sadly self-defeating. Sadly, because life would be a lot easier if we could just abolish the state and be okay. So, can you see the sort of self-defeating aspects of this argument? In what way does it prove that there were people who were evil before the state came to be?
Well, what does my good friend Wolf have to say about it?
Alright, Wolf has a great point. So, and by great, and obviously I'm not attributing this necessarily to his super creative idea in this book. It's just an introduction. Obviously we have known of these arguments for a long time, I'm sure, but this is where I learnt of it. So, Wolf says that, well, if everybody was perfectly good before the state, and the state is the source of corruption and evil, then that makes the state a corrupt and evil institution that somebody had to establish.
Oh, there you go.
Well, there you go. Somebody had to establish the state. If everybody were perfectly good, then nobody would have established such an evil and corruptive institution. Somebody had to, some group of evil and some group of evil, self-interested individuals must have established the state. And therefore, even before the state, there were evil and self-interested individuals.
Well, there you go.
So it's self-defeating. We don't need to look into it. We don't, or unless we're really curious about what mechanism, I suppose. So the final and third argument for anarchism of the state of nature, that, or the final and third anarchist argument of the state of nature that Jonathan Wolff explains or puts out, is rational anarchism. This is what he calls it. And the basics of this ideology is that there are other limits on behavior than law. In fact, in the margins of my book here, I named this the Anne objection, because when I first spoke to Anne about what I'd just read, she immediately pointed this out, okay?
Oh?
So, social pressure, public opinion, fear of a poor reputation, even gossip can all influence behavior in the absence of the state, in the absence of law. Imagine right now we were to abolish the state and separate into groups of people with like-minded ideas, which is probably what will happen. There will be a social pressure within that group to abide by those rules, those social rules that you have, and anybody who goes against it will be ostracized.
Yep, if they would... Yeah, I feel like it would, group into like-minded groups, and then said like-minded groups would have to be incredibly like-minded, or, there would be infighting. Lots of it.
Mm-hmm. But so I'm not saying this is perfect, of course, because there will be individuals that disagree. I mean, I'm not an anarchist. But the point is that there are controls over human behavior other than the law. The social pressure, humans are social beings, the other people, social constructs will create, the idea is, will create a barrier to violence and evil because it's against the norms, right?
Right.
And the reason why they say that this is not equivalent to a state is that people can opt in or out. It's just social constructs. You don't have to abide by them. You're just pressured to abide by them.
But if you opt out, then you're free to just be
Mm.
awful.
You have seen the obvious dilemma. Because now, the group of people have to decide what they do about those that go against the social rules. It's one thing to just shun them, but they're killing you, so what do you do? If you banish them or punish them, you are no different from a state. The social norms have just become laws, and you're punishing the offenders.
Just ask them nicely until they quit.
That'll work. But if you don't banish or punish them, then they can just exploit everyone constantly. And now we'll probably even enter Hobbesian warfare because everybody's afraid of some rotten apple in the group exploiting you.
There you go.
The fear and suspicion happens, and we get the vicious cycle again. The vicious cycle that I've explained to so many people now that I am sick of it myself.
Right. But yeah,
So-
I feel like it would be a bit more interesting to like look into more how do I say, unfounded ideas. No, like not exactly, you know.
Welcome to Paradigm Shift, your unbiased source of
But
philosophy.
that's not what I mean, though. I mean, I'm talking like not exactly, flat Earth level unfounded, but just like a less, more unconventional ideas
Mm,
that are a bit less, founded in fact,
yeah,
and
you're right.
that have less defense.
Absolutely. It's always super interesting. I mean, it's sort of what we're doing right now, though. It's like we look at all these thinkers and we sort of debunk each one in turn to some extent and find that the truth is somewhere in between, right?
Right. Which is what we
So
strive
there's-
for.
It's not too different. And it's something that hopefully we'll be able to continue to do. It depends on who Jonathan or Wolf prioritizes. And who our viewers can tip us off about. Please continue to do so. David Hume was a good point, and Google suggested many others, but unfortunately we just don't have infinite time. This is the problem with every single episode we record, is I say, there's so much more we could talk about, but I can't. So you'll just have to accept the series of episodes that we're recording now. These next 5 that will be about fundamental concepts in political philosophy. You'll just have to accept that we're not going to be able to cover everything. Take it more as an introduction, and maybe even an alternative to reading this book. Sorry, Jonathan Wolf.
I don't think he minds.
I don't think he minds, because we have like 2 viewers.
And also, he is not alive, I'm assuming.
Wolf?
Is he?
He is alive.
Oh!
This is the 3rd edition of an introduction to political philosophy. It was published.
Please don't sue us.
We're not. It's not against copyright.
I know. It's not yet. I mean, wait
Not
until
yet.
Article 13.
This is the 3rd edition, published in 2016. He's updated it every 10 years. The 1st edition was published in 1996.
Fascinating. Okay, so Wolf is
So
like...
it's meant for current students.
He's
It's
a-
recommended on the Oxford page for
Okay.
politics, philosophy, and economics as sort of pre-reading.
Right, I didn't know if Wolf was like someone old or like...
Yeah. In fact, this man was the professor of my history teacher in at UCL,
Huh.
University College London.
Oh, there you go.
There you go. That's why she recommended it to me.
Right, yeah, I just assumed because Wolf sounds like an old name.
It does a little bit, and also we've talked so much about just old people. that-
Exactly. Like
it's
when
a
you...
surprise, and I'm like, oh yeah, by the way, my main source for this is something that was published 3 years ago.
Yeah, when you've got like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, then like Wolf
Yeah.
just adds to the bunch perfectly.
It does. It sounds like it's just somebody who was examining what what political philosophy had done so far in like the 1800s. but no, it's like we're on the cutting edge, Eric. We're on the cutting edge right now.
Whoa, this is modern. We're innovating.
Yeah.
We're not innovating.
We're not innovating. But in conclusion, out of the anarchist arguments, the 3rd one is the most rational, but it has the problem that in the end, the argument for rational anarchism and the argument for the state are sort of indistinguishable, because one requires becoming a state-like institution. Because you have to punish and /banish / otherwise
Right.
enact justice on people who go against your social norms. So what is the difference between you being a state, right? And Jonathan Wolff just sort of summarizes or concludes by saying that, well, perhaps we just haven't seen an example of people living in a peaceful state without the government, and we will have to re-examine anarchism in future chapters, because this was the first chapter of the book that we've just discussed. In future chapters, because even though we've demonstrated that the state becomes intolerable, the state of nature becomes intolerable in the end and a government becomes necessary, according to all these thinkers, we haven't looked at the arguments for the state, the positive arguments for the state. We've looked at the arguments regarding the state of nature. We haven't really looked at the arguments regarding the state, because if it turns out that the state is an extremely oppressive institution and extremely bad, then the badness of the state of nature may still be preferable to the badness of the state, right?
Right.
So that'll be next episode.
Yeah, that'll be a good talking point.
It's gonna be great.
A good talking point, yes.
So, do you have any final remarks on what you've learned?
This is basically why I call anarchism a crap tier ideology.
We should make an ideology tier.
Ideology tier list. Right, we're not biased.
We can do it at the end.
We can do it at the end. Perfect.
Of the entirety of the podcast.
Of the entirety. When episode 100.
Episode 100.
Okay, so in 30 years.
In 30 years. Yeah, we've done 6 episodes in 6 months, so so an additional 90 episodes will take.
I mean, if we keep at this pace,
time.
Yeah.
12 episodes a year. Oh dear. This pace. Yeah. So in a decade, we may have an answer.
That
wouldn't be bad.
Sounds reasonable.
Actually, imagine being knowing like pretty much everything there is to do about politics and philosophy in just 10 years. Sounds
a
good.
decade to build an ideology tier list.
I'm down. All right. So, in conclusion, anything that rationally resembles a state of nature eventually becomes intolerable. And we say that resembles a state of nature because rational anarchism doesn't seem to resemble a state of nature, it seems to resemble a state. Okay? So, next episode, is the state worse than the state than the state of nature? Is the state worse than being a rational anarchist? Let's find out, okay?
Sounds like a plan.
Sounds like a plan. Thank you everyone for watching. If you paid attention this far, I'm very impressed. It's been a long episode, but it's been a good one. It's been a good one.
It's been a good one.
Talk to your family and friends about this, Eric.
I will not.
Oh, that's a shame.
Nah, probably.
I'm gonna advertise this episode to everyone. It's the best episode we've had so far.
Absolutely.
Actually, I do think it's good, but I feel like we say that at the end of every episode. It's like, this one was good.
I mean,
this one was better than the last one.
No, this one definitely feels the best so far. I mean, yeah, that is how natural improvement works, but at the same time, I feel like we really knocked this one out of the park.
We really knocked this one out of the park. We focused on a fundamental tenet of political philosophy, and we came to a conclusion. This is promising.
Haha.
Alright, Eric. Thanks for the episode. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for doing all the work.
We'll have to add... We should add this book into the sources. Can you do that for me?
I can do that.
Nice. So, thank you everyone for watching. If you made it this far, leave a comment. If you just skipped to the end to hear me say this,
leave a different comment.
Leave a different comment, and we'll see. We'll count how many comments we get. My bet is on 0. What do you think?
I'm gonna give it 2, actually.
2? Okay, well, I'm gonna leave a comment then to try to reach this goal.
Okay, 3 then.
3 then? Okay, fine. 2 comments, not including comments from me or you. Okay?
All right, perfect.
Okay. All right. Have a good one, everyone.
We'll see you next time.